Hello and welcome to the video tutorial on the Renaissance. This time period took place between 1300 and 1600 in Europe, but it started in the northern part of Italy. Well, before I explain what exactly the Renaissance is, although I'm sure it's a familiar term, I want to explain the historical setting that led to it and the contributing factors. So the first one is the aftermath of the plague and the war that took place in the 1300s. After surviving this very difficult time period, many people wanted to celebrate human life and human spirit after all the death and destruction. And they start to question the institutions of the Middle Ages, institutions such as the king or the lords, the nobility, and the church. People start asking questions like, why did there have to be so much suffering? Why couldn't the church help relieve the suffering? Why didn't God help us? Why didn't the government help us? Okay, so they start doubting and feeling insecure. And this leads to a new kind of philosophy and perspective. The term Renaissance literally means a rebirth. Okay, renacimiento, just like in the Spanish. And there was a revival in art and culture from the ancient worlds of Greece and Rome. It began in northern Italy mainly for the following reasons. Italy has a deep culture and history based in ancient Rome, the classical art, so they're able to look back at this, the artifacts that they have in the ruins, also because of the Crusades and the trade routes and the location of the cities in northern Italy. They were bigger and more urban. There were a lot of people passing through, so many new ideas were exchanged. And another important factor was the consequences of the plague in these places. Due to the plague, there were a lot of economic changes, okay? Many people died, therefore there were less workers, and so the people who were available to work were able to demand more money to work, okay, because they were needed. This meant that it was more difficult for the merchants or the businessmen to expand their businesses, so they started looking for other opportunities to invest in. This leads the merchants to find the new opportunity in art, okay? So the merchants and businessmen become patrons of different artists. This means they sponsor them, pay them to paint particular pictures or make particular sculptures. One of the most important families in Florence, in northern Italy at the time, were the Medici family. They were very important bankers. They became involved in the government in Florence, and Lorenzo de' Medici in particular is one of the most famous patrons of the Renaissance artists that there is. Okay, the main focus of the Renaissance artists was on humanism. Okay, humanism is a philosophical idea based on the idea of human potential. So people focus in on the person, on the individual, on what they are capable of doing, and less on outside influences. So this causes a big change in the medieval values, okay? Medieval values step away from the church, from God, and piety, and focus in on the person. There are three main characteristics of Renaissance art. The first one is a change and a move towards using perspective in paintings. The next one is that religious subjects are painted and treated in different works of art, but in a realistic way. So they really want to paint the person as they look, although almost in an ideal way. And finally, portraits. Okay, portraits of important people. They're commissioned by these important people usually, and the painters paint them as realistically as possible. So here is an example of a Renaissance painting. I want you to try and identify the characteristic that you can see, one of the main characteristics that was used in the Renaissance. So take a moment, think about it, and hopefully you can choose correctly. Hopefully you answered perspective. Okay, also it is a realistic painting, but here is a perfect example of the use of perspective because it's like 3 dimensions but on a flat surface, where our eye is brought into the back of the painting to show depth. Okay, this is called the School of Athens by Raphael, one of the best Renaissance paintings of. Okay, what characteristic of Renaissance art can you see here? I'm sure a lot of you have actually seen this particular sculpture on your visit to Rome. The answer is religious subject matter, but in a realistic way, okay? This is a sculpture done by Michelangelo. It shows the Virgin Mary and her son Jesus after he's been taken down from the cross. It's called La Pietà, or the Pietà. Absolutely beautiful, and you can see it's a religious subject matter, but it's extremely realistic. Here are some close-ups of the facial expressions of Mary and Jesus, just so you can see the accuracy, the realism, the emotion, and the beauty in the sculpture. And finally, the most famous painting from the Renaissance ever, the Mona Lisa, which depicts portraiture. Okay, it's a portrait of a noble woman. You can see the realistic portrayal of her and her very intriguing expression, and this is found in the Louvre in Paris. Another important concept arose during the Renaissance, and that was of the Renaissance man. This is an expression we still use in English to mean a man or a person, that is very accomplished in many, many areas. It's almost like the universal man, and here we use the word man to denote both men and women, okay? So an example of a Renaissance man from the Renaissance is Leonardo da Vinci. I'm sure you know that he was well accomplished in many, many areas, okay? He was a painter, he was an inventor, he was a biologist, he knew kind of a lot about everything. And this is the epitome of a Renaissance man. This is a drawing done by Da Vinci, found in one of his notebooks, and it's called the Vitruvian Man, okay? It's showing the perfect proportions of the human body. And this is a really good example that represents the entire Renaissance idea of the human, the individual, and idealism. Human being individual and idealism, because it's like they want to represent the perfect human. So he's perfectly proportioned. The measurements of his legs to his torso, to his arms, to his head, and everything are extremely proportional. Another example of the perfection of the human body, or the representation of perfection in Renaissance art, is the statue of David found in Florence. Again, it's realistic, but it's idealistic, so it's like an ideal representation of the human body. This was sculpted by Michelangelo, one of the most beautiful sculptures of the time. And finally, I'll touch on the writers. Some famous writers of the time are Dante. He was an Italian writer, and he used the vernacular, which is the common language of the people. This was another change towards allowing the ordinary people to access literature and ideas that they couldn't before if they didn't understand Latin. And Machiavelli, he was a politician who wrote a book called The Prince about how to be an excellent ruler. Okay, so in this slide you can see a statue of Machiavelli here and a copy of his book, The Prince. This was about being a great political leader. He emphasized that people are liars and generally not good people necessarily, and that a good political leader needs to be crafty and witty and do whatever necessary to dominate. Okay, political guide. Okay, and finally we have some revision questions based on what you've just learned from the video. You should go through them, make sure you can answer them all. There's this slide and another 5 on the next slide. Thank you for listening. I hope you've learned something, and good luck studying.